Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about layering basslines, which in the last few years, and psytrance in particular, have become a little bit of a trend. Basslines tend to become more and more complex, and therefore layering is often required to create those kinds of basslines. And today, therefore, I want to kind of go over the basics of layering and show some of the simple things that you can do. There are more complex things that can be done with layering. But I'm not going to dive too much into it. Maybe in another video, if you guys want to, I'll go for some more complex ideas with layering that can be done. So for now, let's talk about the simple things. I'm first going to start with giving two examples of layered basslines, and these are both projects that I've made and we're going to deconstruct. So let's look into that. All right, so this is the first bassline that we're going to deconstruct. Normal 16-note bassline. And here's the second, which is more of a slide bass, a little bit more progressive and a little bit more complex as well. So we're going to learn how to make both of those basslines, and that will be in a little bit. I first want to talk about some of the theory behind layering. So the reason why you would layer sounds is there's actually three main reasons. The first one is the amount of control that you have over the final sound, because you're basically dividing up the main sound into multiple different sections. You have a lot more control over each individual section, and therefore you might be able to enhance some of the details of your sound. As I mentioned, it helps with dividing up complex sound into simple sounds. And a third thing is that it allows you to create sounds that you otherwise wouldn't. So for example, the entire bassline that we just heard, that sliding bass, wouldn't be able to be done in one patch. It's just too complicated for that. And therefore, dividing it up, you get more control over it, but also just more possibilities with what you can do with the different sounds. So there's four main issues that you need to keep in mind when layering basslines. Those issues are phase, function, tone, and over-complication. I'm going to go over all four of them and talk a little bit in detail about what each of them means and why it is a problem and what you can do to combat that problem. All right, so for phase, I'm going to open up the whiteboard so that I can draw a little bit and I can demonstrate a little bit more. It's just an easier way for me to explain. So before I tell you what the problem is with phase, we need to look at what phase actually is. So imagine we have just a simple sine wave. Now you can imagine this being something that is played by a synthesizer. So what will happen is it will play through this sound and then it will loop back and play through the sound again. And that will continue on until the synthesizer is no longer required to output the sound. And therefore, it's basically just looping this little waveform over and over. And that's really what the synthesizer does. It's looping a small waveform to create longer waves, so you can play notes with them and add modifications, modulations, automation, whatever you want to put on that. But in essence, the very start of an oscillator is just outputting a waveform and looping that waveform. But there's a little bit of a problem there in that it's not clear where you should start it. I've now drawn this sine wave like this, but I could easily start at the bottom, go up, and then go down again. This is also a valid sine wave, the second one. It's just that it starts from a different point. Basically, it starts right here, where you would where this one is lower, there's where it started. It's not drawn perfectly, but you get the idea. So determining where the waveform starts is what the phase does. So imagine basically that you have this waveform around a circle. So let's draw a little circle here. I hope you can still see that on the board. Yes, you can. And then you imagine the wave kind of being warped around it. So it will start by going down, and then it will go up again, and then it will go down again. So this is basically a sine wave around a circle, right? If you take this sine wave and warp it around this circle, let's draw for comparison, this is where the red line would be in this example. And this is easier because now we can explain the measurements of phase, why I'm drawing the circle. Because the way it works is that you have a line here and then another line, and then you measure the amount of degrees between those two lines. So that means that, for example, 90 degrees, which would be right there, would result in a waveform that sits right here, which in our case, 90 degrees would be here, and therefore we would get a wave starting from this point, which is this second wave again. So from there we can basically take this circle and just again stretch it out. The circle is only used because it's an easier way to indicate degrees. If you degrees on the line doesn't really make sense. So therefore I draw this circle so you know where the degrees come from. But now you imagine taking that circle out again and turning it back into a straight line, and then you can still have the notation of where those degrees are. So where the 90 degrees is, where the 180 degrees is, where the 270 degrees is, and where the 360 degrees is, and all the other degrees in between. And you kind of know where on the line they are. So that's how you calculate the phase. Now, it's a little bit weird to talk about it because I could easily say, well, if this is my starting wave, then a 90-degree phase is going to result in a different starting point than if this is my starting wave. And that means that that the synth needs to define how the starting wave looks. And there's not really a standard for that. Often what they'll say is they'll start at the 0 point. They don't like to start at right here, because if then the phase is 0, which is basically then the standard. If you don't modify the phase, it will be 0. It will start not at the 0 point, which can cause audio clicks if the attack is very low. So in synthesizers, the phase or the wave usually starts from a 0 point, and then using the phase you can choose any other point in the waveform. Alright, so to show you what I mean in an actual synthesizer, I've taken a serum here and I've created two waveforms in there, which were the waveforms that we saw on the whiteboard before. We have a sine wave and another sine wave with a different initial phase here. And what we can do is we can use this phase, and as you can see it's measured in degrees, to indicate the starting point, which is the yellow line that you see on this oscillator. Serum is very visual at this point, and there are other synths that don't visualize this kind of thing, and there are even synths that don't have a phase control as deep as Serum has, which means that they'll have either a fixed phase, which is a fixed starting point for the waveform to play, or they have multiple waveforms that you can choose from. So you have a sine wave that looks like this, as well as a sine wave that looks like this. So you can choose two starting points for the sine wave. In this case, I can just actually go through it and choose a fixed standing point. For example, let's set 180 degrees, but I can also choose a randomness amount, which will randomize a point within basically the yellow area that we see right now. So you'll get a little bit of randomization, or you can just have it start playing at a random point. What is important is that it's always just one point that it starts playing at, and that it's determined by the phase. This control just adds randomness to that phase parameter. So the real problem with phase is not the phase itself. That's all just a property of sound where it starts playing. But the problem comes in when you look at what phase does when you have two of similar sounds with similar frequencies but with different phases. Then something can happen called constructive interference or destructive interference. These are two versions of the same problem, and that has to do with summing. So what happens when you play multiple waveforms is that they're summed together. So if we look at this waveform, you can see it's going up and then going down and going back up again. Whereas this is doing the exact opposite, going down, going back up and going down again. Now, if we play these at the same time, starting from the same phase, what will happen is that this up point, which has, let's say, a value of 1, and this down point, which has a value of -1, at the exact same point are going to be summed together, resulting in a 0. And in fact, if I put some MIDI into this, You can see I'm pressing MIDI. You can see it's trying to output something, but it's not actually outputting anything. And if I turn this one off, it is. Or if I turn this one off, it also is. But if we have both of them on, because they're the exact opposite of the other, they're not going to play anything. Now what happens if I take this phase and put it to 180 degrees? Then they're actually going to sum and going to construct together instead of destruct, which was the last example, is destructive interference. They're summing together to form a lower volume, or in this case, complete silence. Here they're going to sum together into a higher volume. So therefore it's called constructive interference instead of destructive interference. It's a little terminology, it doesn't really matter, it's the same problem in essence. But what we have is now that the volume is actually going to go higher. So if I now turn this off, you can see there's a difference in volume, both here at this meter, but it's easier to catch there. So those are some problems when you're layering sounds together, because usually when you layer, you have similar sounds or sounds that work within the same frequency range, and therefore these kind of interferences can come up if you're not careful. The way you can prevent this is to just look at both the sound design of your waveform. I'll show a few examples, especially in that slide bass example. There's actually a few tricks that I used to basically isolate frequencies and make sure that for the more important frequencies of the sound, this kind of stuff just doesn't happen. So that's something that we'll take a look at a later point. But for now, you just need to know that this is something that can happen within sounds, and there's a reason why you should look out for or look at the phase of your sounds and the phase of your of your waveforms when you're playing them and when you're layering them. So the second problem is not really a problem, it's more something to consider. It can be a problem if you're taking it to extreme, but that's using multiple sounds for the same function. So when you're layering, usually what you want to have is that each layer of your sound has a separate, unique function which it performs well. And instead, what I often see is people kind of just layering things on top of each other without really knowing why they do it. And it's a much better approach to beforehand look at what you want to add to the sound, what the sound actually needs, and then specifically add a layer to the sound for that function. So maybe your sound needs a little bit more stereo width, you'll add some very wide sound. And if you want a sound to have a little bit more click, you'll add a very clicky sound which doesn't have any sustain and no release, and basically only focuses on the click. Maybe if you want a sound that to have a little bit more high end, you can add a layer that only focuses on the high end and remove all the mid range and low range from the sound using an EQ. That way you only have to focus on the high end of that sound. The reason why this is a better approach than just to layer sounds on top of each other is because when you layer things on top of each other, their volumes are going to add up, and you're very easily going to fill up a mix of the sound with the sound that you're layering. And that means that if you have less layers, then you have less volume that you need to worry about, and therefore you have more headroom, and it's easier to add other elements on top of the layered sound that you already have. There isn't going to be one part of the track that's only one sound. You often want ambience and risers and all kind of other sounds behind to support even maybe like a kick and bass, obviously, or maybe like lead sounds. So if you have one sound that contains so many layers that it's already taking up all the volume of your track, you're gonna have a hard time adding more layers to that, or adding other elements to that, and which means that therefore it's just better to not do that, to just go with as few layers as possible, and therefore you need to think about the function of each of those layers. So now I want to talk about the tone. The tone of a sound is a little bit hard to define, but it basically means the frequencies and the volume of those frequencies that the sound is playing in. So here I have an example of why that could be a problem. I'm layering two waveforms, so you can see a sine wave together with a very high frequency wave. You can see all these points, basically going up and down and up and down. And which means that there's a lot of high frequency content going to be in this wave, and this wave is going to go and produce only low frequency content. And when you put them together, they sound kind of weird, like there's missing something in between them, at least to me. So this is it playing. And for me, it really sounds like there's something that could be in between there. So now if we take a saw wave and use that instead of the sine wave, you can already hear that it's a different sound and it works better, at least for me, because this does have the mid-range, whereas sine wave does not have any mid-range. It's just one frequency that it plays at, and in our case it was a very low frequency. So now with these two combined, it sounds a lot better. All right, so that means that's the theory. What that means in practice when you're actually layering sounds is that you kind of need not only the sound to have a separate function, but those functions need to be, at least in terms of frequency, in terms of tone, need to be fairly close together. It is it's probably not going to sound good if you have just a sine wave and layer it with some very high frequency content without providing any mid-range in between them, or have a sine wave and then a few basically a few harmonics of nothing, and then your higher mid-range as well. That duck in frequency that's going to sit in between those things isn't going to sound very good. Other than that, there are some sounds that just don't sound alike. For example, you might have one FM sound and another being a different way of generating sounds, and those might not work well together. So the tone of a sound also has to do with just the actual sound itself. How does it sound? And does it work well with the other sounds that I'm trying to layer it on? So that's something that you need to keep in mind as well when working with different layers, to see if the tone, both in terms of the frequency content as well in the overall sound of the sound, just kind of work well together, and if it's the right layer. So when I'm mentioning this seems very obvious that you need to worry about those things, but I often hear people not really worrying about those things, and it kind of shows in their productions. So I often give feedback, and when we talk about layering within given feedback, I see that this is one of the parts that people really lack on, is finding the right sounds to put together. What's 2 sounds or 3 sounds that really well or really work together well? How do you find those? And that's why I want to go over the 2 basslines that I have to show you how I would do that. Before we go over those basslines, I do want to talk about over-complication. I have one example that is a little bit more complex, but that's kind of towards the line of where I would say you wouldn't want to make it more complex than that. Often when layering, especially in if you look at progressive house tutorials, what people do is they'll stack 8, 9, maybe even more than that, different sounds on top of each other. And again, I've advised against that because of the function, but it just also makes your project and your workflow a lot more complicated, and you have to think a lot more while producing. And I often find when I'm producing, I want things to go as fast as possible so that I can get my musical ideas out there into the DAW as fast as possible. And by overcomplicating things, by thinking that you need 12 or more layers, or whatever the number is that they use in tutorials or just online, what that tends to do is that it clogs up your mind, really worrying about the amount of layers that you need instead of the actual music that you're trying to write. And therefore, I would say don't overcomplicate it. If you really want 12 layers, what I would suggest, or if you want 12 layers because you have a function for those and you have an idea for those, what I would suggest is you would start off your production with a few layers, like 3 or 4. Write down somewhere in your notes what you want the other layers to be, but only work with those 3 or 4 layers until your musical idea is thought out, and then go back and add the other layers if you really think it's still necessary. Because you will often find that if you don't add those layers and you add the supporting elements, you add just the rest of the track basically, and you add good mixing and mastering, that you really don't need all those elements that you thought you would need. And therefore you save a bunch of time not having to do sound design or preset browsing or just opening up synth sounds that you would otherwise have spent creating sounds that don't really add anything to the overall musical idea. All right, now we're going to look at the two examples that I showed off at the beginning of this video. We're going to start off with that 16-note bass line. I'm going to play it for you again so you can hear what it sounds like. And we're going to go over the layers of this sound. So I'm going to start off with my normal bass line, which actually consists out of 2 layers. For those who watch me for a long time will know that when I make a bass line, I'll have my bass note that's competing with my kick on a separate track than the beats that aren't competing with my kick. If we look at the kick drum here, you can see that here there's still the subwave of the kick. So this note is competing with this subwave or sub of the kick, whereas these notes have no sub bass to compete against. So that actually this makes me make different decisions on what these notes should be. So if we look at this, if I open up this patch in Serum, you can see that there's a lot of sub bass here. In the lowest harmonic, there's a lot of sub bass. Whereas if we look at this one, there's no sub bass. I've removed the sub bass from there, so it's not competing with the sub bass of the kick. Now this isn't really a layer as they're not playing together, but now we're actually going to look at some of the layers. So here we have a stereo layer. So the function of this layer is to just add stereo width to the sound. So if we do it without it, you can hear the bass completely in mono. Whereas with the stereo layer, it will also sound like it has some stereo elements to it. Now you can see it's very slight. I've actually set this to -12 decibels compared to the other sounds. And if we look at the patch, it's actually the same patch that I used for the other one. It does have some stereo here, or some sub bass here, as well as a little bit of stereo in there. I've added a hyper with a re-trigger on, which also adds a little bit of stereo element. But the main stereo is coming from the stereo spread, which I actually discussed in my last video. If you want to watch it, it's all about stereo width. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. So this is doing the stereo winding, and then we have an M equalizer, which is mainly rolling off the low ends and also adding a little bit of tone to it. This is again to remove all of the sub bass from it, so that the sub bass here doesn't clash with the kick. I could just do that in the patch as well, but in this case I decided to do it with an equalizer, just because it gives a different tone. Finally, we have the click layer here. Now if we turn this off, you can hear that there's a little bit of click lacking in the high end, at least for me. It doesn't feel as powerful. Now part has to do with the way I mix this, and that's because, as you can see, we have a very sharp low pass filter here. And this low pass filter actually came into being after I added this click layer, so that I would have more space for this click layer. So in that case, again, talking about tone and functionality, as well as kind of mixing the layers together, what we're doing is I'm identifying a problem. In this case, the problem was that I didn't like the click of my original bassline. We found a solution by creating a new patch that just creates the click, and then I basically increased the problem of not having a click in the bassline by actually removing the original click and then mixing in the other click that we have here. So playing those two together again sounds like this. And this, as you can hear, is just a click, which I believe, again, comes from the same patch with a little bit more modifications to it. Mainly the volume LFO is very short, and I've completely opened up the envelope here for the filter. So that means that the high end is always playing. And again, here the phase is set in such a way that it's just before this click here, which means that it's going to play this click in this very short amount of time. And therefore, this click is basically going to play and then it's going to go to silence, meaning that you really only have that first click that you see here on the waveform, this very start, and then it's just going to go to silence right after that, which just leaves you with the click, which is really what we wanted. So the idea for the sound design here was to just capture this very start of the sound so that we could process it individually. As you can see here, we've done that with this EQ, and basically we're isolating the click so that we can just process it on its own at a different EQ curve than we would be able to do in within this patch or within these 3 layers. And therefore we're just using this layer to function as only the click and nothing else. So that's this bassline. Let's look at the other bassline, the sliding bass. Again, that's one is a little bit more complex, so it's going to take a little bit more time for me to go over that. So here it is. I'm going to play it both filtered and unfiltered. This is actually a section from a track that I'm working on. Therefore, there's also a filtering. So it sounds like this. So let's actually go over the individual layers that make up the sound. Now there's basically 5 layers to this sound. Here you can see 4 groups, and this group consists of 2 different sounds. So I would consider those 2 different layers, but for the rest, I would consider each track here to be just 1 layer. So if we take it like this, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 layers. So this is the main sound that we have. Which is just basically a normal sliding bass line. I can quickly open up this patch. It's, as you can see, something that I designed here. We have a basic filter cutoff modulation as well as some volume modulation that just adds that sliding effect. And then there's a 1 semitone pitch bend going up. Which just add that little bit of character to it. The sound design isn't too complex. We have a saw wave where I've just removed all of the high end from. And then here we have another saw wave, as you can see from the harmonic series, where I randomized the phases, which you can do by randomize all. And then I just removed the lower 2 octaves, just turned this one down and removed the fundamental completely, so that it wouldn't clash with the fundamental that we have here. So that's the patch here. There's some effects on it and some processing, but I'm not going to go over all of those things because you mainly want to focus on the layering for that. Then here we have a tone layer. Now the function of this tone layer is to add some extra mid-range grittiness. So they sound like this. So if we combine these 2, you can already hear that there's some movement between the different bars. If you look at this bar in particular, or in this sound in particular, you can hear that all 4 of the beats kind of sound the same. It's just the same sound all over again, over and over again. So here I wanted to add some variations between those 4 beats in the bar. So that's what these sounds are doing. And the way I did this, if we look at one of these sounds here, is that I just created a patch starting from a saw wave and by removing a lot of the different harmonics. In this case, what I did is I went here and I set clear high frequencies, and then I put some of them back in, but you can see from this part it's removed. And I also removed the fundamental of all of these. So that's very important. The second thing is that I detuned them, and that creates stereo width. So it sits in the side, meaning that it's a little bit more separated from the mono bassline that we have here. And again, this is the same thing. If we look at this other track, you'll see it's just a different variation of that same idea, messing with the individual harmonics and messing with the individual fades in this case, and just removing the fundamental and making it detuned. And in this case also distorted and low passed. So I just basically generated 4 different tones for each bar and just messed around with the order and the way they were played and stuff like that. And then they went into this
pedal, as well as this EQ, which is really doing the main tone of it. As you can see, there's our modulation here. So that's just doing the modulation on that, and maybe opening it up slightly and closing it slightly is just kind of changing the tone of the sound. The third layer is this reverb plug that I created. Oh. Now this is mainly there to add some movement and to add some ambience, because of that dipping. The sidechain really adds some movement. But the main idea here is that we're also adding some much needed higher mid-range. If we just listen to these two sounds alone, it's really kind of cutting off just after the lower mid-range, and it doesn't really sound natural. Now if we put this reverb plug back in, you can hear it kind of smooths off nicely towards the high frequencies. This layer being offbeat also helps with just making it swing a little bit more. So that's one of the other functions. I could just place this on the start, and then it would still have that effect of adding that higher end, but it just doesn't sound the same. So if I loop this, it doesn't really sound the same as having it on the offbeat, where it adds a little bit of extra swing. So one thing that we should note for this layer here is that it's still based on saw waves. Here we have a normal saw wave, and here again we have a saw wave with randomized phases for each of the harmonics. And the reason why I do that is to keep the tone similar. So that means that again, what we talked about, the problem with the tone, because these are all saw waves, I don't have to worry about if they're going to sound similar, because I'm in the sound design, I'm actually already using similar sounds. Always using saw waves means that it's always going to sound very close to the other sounds in the same layers. So for this one, the notable thing here is that I'm downsampling it, which creates a lot of high end, and that's being controlled here with this EQ, and then the reverb is added. So that means that it's nicely rolling off. If you look at the spectrum here, it's nicely rolling off the high end there. You can still hear that it's being downsampled, and you can actually see the two peaks there, but they're not too in your face. Like if you turn this off, it's going to be too extreme. Right, so the next layer is this saw plugs layer here, and as you can see, what we have here is just some extra saw plugs that add a little bit of rhythm to it, without this, as well as this one, which is also adding rhythm to it, as you can see by using plugs. It just kind of sounds a little bit like it's not having enough movement for me. And already if we put this saw plug back in, it's already has a lot more movement. So this saw plug here, it's just again a saw wave with randomized phases for each harmonic going through a filter and some effects. Not a lot of stuff going on here. I wanted to see, yeah, the velocity is what is creating the drive, as well as the gain down, as well as just overall volume level, which means that we can use velocity data to set the volume basically, and as well as the amount of distortion in this particular sound. So the final thing to note here is that this is completely mono, or almost completely mono. You can see it's just 21% width, which is going to really limit the amount of stereo information this sound is going to have. And for that, that's where the last layer comes in, which is just a sampled bassline from a track from Asterix, the Gaia 3 bassline, which I happened to have a sample for. So what I modified it, I changed the way it played, I changed the pattern that it played, and we pitched it up by an octave and add stereo width in 2 different ways. The stereo generator is something I talked about in the last video, as well as the stereo spread. And then again, using an EQ to basically place it in its own frequency context. We don't want it to be too low or too high, otherwise it would take up too much space in the mix, and in this case it doesn't. It's just focused to that middle area there, those basically the lower mid-range there. So altogether sounds like this, with also a kick. Now you might notice that individual layers don't come across as the way they sound. Actually, I should turn this on, sorry. You can still you don't really hear the individual layers, and that's really the main point of all of this video, is that your layers, they should work together to form one sound. Again, barely being able to notice that this track was turned off. As you can hear. This is very much a detail, this sound that we have here. And the reason for still adding those details is that it just makes your sound a little bit more professional sounding, and it sounds like you really took the time and took the attention into this sound to work this in. So the final thing I want to say about this particular sound is that it took me a very long time to make. I think I'd spent over 2 hours with the thing that you see here right now, which is just like an 8-bar loop of it repeating. Basically, it's repeating the same bar over and over again. And just that took me like 1 or 2 hours to make, because it's a very complex process, and you shouldn't expect something like this to just happen. There's a lot of tracks that went into this that I eventually scrapped, a lot of ideas, a lot of layers that I went into this and that I then scrapped again. So don't worry with like restarting something if you're not particularly happy with how it sounds. And yeah, there's no shame in doing that. The only thing that you need to worry about is that it sounds good. And hopefully throughout this video I was able to give some pointers on how that could be done. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, if you enjoyed these tips, please let me know by leaving a like, as well as maybe a comment. For now, that's going to be it. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.